June 6th, 1944, Omaha Beach. At 6:47 a.m., the shoreline is a mix of surf, smoke, and explosions. 3 demolition teams have already vanished in bursts of sand and steel, each one claimed by another buried teller mine. The engineers are dying faster from hidden charges than from German gunfire. Corporal James Mitchell crouches in the rising water, watching the chaos unfold. Beside him, Captain Robert Hayes fights to shout orders over the constant detonations. Their assignment is simple on paper and impossible in practice. Clear a 50-meter path through the minefield before the next assault wave hits, which is in just 14 minutes. At the current pace, they won't survive long enough to clear even 20 meters. 12 of the 16 Navy demolition units that landed in the first wave are already reporting casualties above 60%. Teller mines, planted in dense and overlapping patterns, are turning the beach into a slaughterhouse. What neither Mitchell nor Hayes can see, less than 100 meters downshore, is that a two-year-old private, with no engineering background at all, is about to solve a problem that has defeated trained specialists since 1939. By the summer of 1944, the German teller mine had already earned a brutal reputation. 5 years of refinement had turned it into one of the Wehrmacht's most lethal defensive tools. Each mine packed roughly 12 pounds of TNT and required only 200 pounds of pressure to explode more than enough to vaporize a man crawling across the sand. Across the invasion beaches, the Germans had buried them in staggered grids stretching from Norway to Greece. Allied engineers had studied the numbers, and the numbers were unforgiving. Close to 4,000 mines were believed to be hidden across the 5 landing zones in Normandy. The official technique for finding them was slow, nerve-shredding work. Engineers were expected to inch forward on their stomachs, probing the sand with bayonets at a 45-degree angle until metal contact revealed a pressure plate. Each mine took 3 to 5 minutes to locate, assuming the probing didn't strike too hard and set it off. Under machine gun fire or incoming artillery, the process became even slower and far more dangerous. Every known approach had been tested. Every known approach was failing. British units had developed the Bangalore torpedo, a long, explosive tube meant to clear obstacles in front of infantry. It shredded barbed wire with ease, but behaved unpredictably when buried mines were involved. Sometimes it triggered sympathetic detonations, sometimes it didn't. The failure rate hovered around 40%, leaving fresh craters that slowed the assault and exposed advancing infantry to German fire. American forces experimented with trained dogs capable of smelling explosive compounds. The theory looked flawless on paper. In combat, the animals panicked under bombardment, and several bolted toward their handlers with mines still strapped to their harnesses. At least 3 handlers were killed in accidents, and the program was quietly abandoned. The French resistance suggested probing with long wooden poles while lying prone. It reduced casualties but dragged detection time to 7 minutes per mine, far too slow for amphibious assaults, as proven at Anzio earlier that year, where an entire day of progress was lost. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel analyzed those shortcomings and, in response, ordered his engineers to increase mine density throughout the Atlantic Wall. Every failure the Allies suffered only encouraged the Germans to plant mines more aggressively. In May 1944, just 1 month before D-Day, senior Allied engineering officers gathered in Portsmouth to evaluate every mine detection method they had. 23 specialists, including Colonel Arthur Trudeau of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, reviewed the entire Allied arsenal. Their conclusion was stark, their wording even harsher. No existing technique could reliably clear mines quickly enough in combat conditions. Projected casualty rates for beach demolition teams exceeded 75% in the first hour of an assault. The consensus was grim and unanimous. Rapid mine clearance under fire was physically impossible. An invasion could succeed only if men were willing to crawl forward slowly and die doing it. That was the reality on June 6th, 1944, right up until a farm boy from Iowa proved them all wrong. Private Thomas Becker's presence on Omaha Beach was, in every sense, a mistake. He wasn't selected for engineering work. He wasn't trained for it. He wasn't even academically qualified for it. Back in Iowa, Becker was supposed to inherit his father's dairy farm. He enlisted at 18 in March 1943, and the Army processed his intake paperwork with a clerical error so minor no one bothered to correct it. A line that should have read, "Farm Equipment Operator," was misread as "Heavy Equipment Operator." That single misinterpretation sent him to the 146th Engineer Combat Battalion instead of a logistics or infantry assignment. His file didn't inspire confidence. Instructors at Fort Belvoir had noted that he showed initiative but lacked theoretical grounding. One officer summarized his assessment with a blunt remark: "Adequate for general labor, not suited for technical roles." The truth, however, was far more complicated. Becker had spent his entire life solving practical problems with whatever materials happened to be nearby. On a dairy farm, equipment rarely fails at convenient moments, and repairs almost always demand improvisation, not textbooks. When a tractor breaks hours before a storm, you don't debate theory. You make it run with whatever tools and wire you can find. When a cow sinks into spring mud, you figure out how to pull it out without breaking its legs. When weather threatens your harvest, you work quickly, make do, and adapt. That upbringing gave Becker something most trained engineers didn't have on Omaha Beach: a mind conditioned to think sideways when everyone else thinks straight. At 6:52 a.m., just minutes after another demolition team vanished in an eruption of sand and explosive force, Becker found himself crouched behind the hull of a crippled landing craft. Smoke drifted low across the tide. The incoming surf churned wreckage, helmets, and shattered timbers onto the sand. Ahead, another engineer lay flat, inching forward with a bayonet, tapping the ground in tiny, trembling motions. It was painfully slow, far too slow. Becker's eyes tracked the waves as they rolled in, then slid over the sand, then to the scattered debris littering the shoreline: fuel cans, ammunition crates, torn satchels, and a few dented, standard-issue water buckets thrown from demolished landing craft. A connection formed so quickly he couldn't explain it in words. He didn't need to. It was the kind of intuitive leap that comes not from classrooms, but from years of brute force problem-solving in places where doing it wrong meant losing crops, livestock, or equipment you couldn't replace. Within moments, Becker grabbed one of the battered buckets, and with that single motion unnoticed by the officers fighting to stay alive around him, the trajectory of the next 6 hours, and of hundreds of Allied lives, quietly shifted direction. Becker filled the bucket halfway with seawater. He didn't shout, didn't signal, didn't ask anyone for permission. He simply waded forward a few steps, crouched low, and tipped the water into the sand. The effect was immediate, though subtle. On untouched sand, the water soaked in evenly, vanishing in a slow, uniform sink. On disturbed sand where something was buried, the water behaved differently. It hesitated. It pooled. It diverted in odd, uneven lines, as though the ground were tilted by a force no one could see. Becker watched it, studied it, then repeated the pour. Same reaction, same distortion in the runoff. He tried a third time, moving a little farther forward, pouring carefully, studying every ripple and curl in the flow pattern. There it was again, a faint but unmistakable anomaly, a buried object, a mine, exactly where the water's behavior had changed. He marked the spot with a scrap of driftwood and shifted sideways, repeating the process. Another abnormal flow. Another marker. A method was taking shape, one no manual had ever mentioned, one no engineer had tested, and one that, in theory, shouldn't work at all. But practice was beating theory, right there in the surf. Behind him, Corporal Mitchell noticed someone moving in the minefield. He assumed he was about to witness another private get torn apart. Instead, he saw Becker pacing in a grid pattern, kneeling, pouring water, rising again, and marking the sand as though following a blueprint only he could see. Mitchell crawled closer, ready to drag the younger man back. "What in God's name are you doing?" he shouted over the chaos. Becker didn't flinch. "Finding mines, Corporal," he said, eyes fixed on the water as it traced its silent map across the sand. "That's not in the manual. Neither is dying in the first 10 minutes, Becker answered. Mitchell hesitated. His training pulled him one way. The reality of the moment pulled him another. In the time it would take a probe team to locate a single mine, Becker had already marked 7, and the spacing of those markers, the staggered pattern, the consistent intervals, matched German doctrine perfectly. Mitchell made a decision that could cost him rank, cost him his life, or save everyone around him. "Keep going," he said. "I'll get more buckets." Within minutes, additional engineers joined Becker, each man armed with a bucket and a new set of eyes. They poured water in sweeping arcs, watching for the slightest hesitation, the smallest shift in direction. When a probe finally struck metal beneath one of Becker's markers, the confirmation hit them like an electric jolt. The method worked, and it worked with terrifying speed. Becker's idea, improvised from seawater, instinct, and a battered bucket, was doing what textbooks, torpedoes, and trained dogs had failed to accomplish. It was reading the hidden geometry of the battlefield, revealing lethal shapes beneath the sand without a single man touching them. A private with no qualifications had just reinvented mine detection, and the clock was still ticking. The minefield began to change shape, not physically, but in the minds of the men moving through it. Where minutes earlier there had been nothing but guesswork and terror, markers now dotted the sand like coordinates on a hidden map. Engineers moved with a clarity they hadn't felt since landing. Mitchell returned with more buckets, and suddenly 6 men were advancing in a loose line, each one pouring water, reading flow patterns, calling out anomalies, and driving sticks into the ground to mark danger. To test the method properly, a combat engineer named Robert Kowalski slid forward with a bayonet and probed one of Becker's flagged spots. 8 inches down, metal rang against steel. A teller mine, sitting exactly where the water had behaved strangely. 3 more probes confirmed 3 more mines. What had begun as a private's improvised hunch was rapidly becoming a system, one faster, safer, and more efficient than anything the Allies had brought to Normandy. But not everyone was ready to accept that. At 7:15 a.m., Captain Robert Hayes stormed onto the scene, his uniform soaked, his voice raw from shouting fire missions. What he saw nearly stopped his heart. A line of engineers moving through a live minefield, without probes, manuals, or standard equipment, carrying buckets. "Who authorized this insanity?" Hayes bellowed. Mitchell stepped forward before anyone else could speak. "Sir, Private Becker developed a new detection method, and it's working." "This is not protocol," Hayes snapped. "Where is this documented? Where is the validation? You cannot invent procedures in a combat zone." "We've confirmed 4 mines in 6 minutes, Mitchell replied, louder this time. 0 casualties. Hayes turned toward Becker, who was still kneeling with a bucket in hand, studying another rivulet of water winding its way across the sand. "This method is illegal," Hayes shouted. "You are violating every engineering standard in the book." Becker finally looked up. His voice was steady. "Sir, we're clearing mines faster than anyone else on this beach. You want us to stop?" Hayes froze. The dead from the probe teams still floated in the surf behind them, their equipment scattered across the tide line. The bodies were a brutal reminder of what approved procedures had achieved that morning. The captain's shoulders fell. "How many are marked?" he asked quietly. 14 so far," Mitchell answered. 7 confirmed. "Any casualties?" "None, sir." Hayes took a breath, the kind you take when your worldview breaks in half. He looked at the markers. He looked at the men. He looked at Becker. "Carry on," he said at last. "But if this kills someone, Private, you'll wish the Germans got to you first." Within minutes, Becker's team was expanding the corridor, their buckets rising and falling like a rhythm section in a deadly orchestra. What the textbooks declared impossible was unfolding in real time, one pour of seawater at a time. By 10 a.m., the transformation was undeniable. What had begun with a single private pouring seawater onto the sand had grown into a coordinated clearance operation. Becker's improvised teams carved 3 navigable corridors through the minefield on Omaha Beach, all without losing a man. 43 mines had been detected and flagged, each one verified exactly where the water patterns predicted. The 29th Infantry Division moved through those freshly cleared lanes, pushing inland beyond the seawall and forming a foothold the invasion desperately needed. Word of the technique spread faster than any official order could have. Combat units on Omaha Beach heard rumors first. "Engineers are using buckets," someone reported. By noon, they were requesting instructions. By the afternoon, British teams at Gold Beach adopted the method as well, filling whatever containers they could find and copying Becker's grid-based approach across their own killing grounds. By nightfall, the story had traveled high enough up the chain of command that SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, sent a request for clarification. Who invented this? Why wasn't it already in doctrine? And how had a method this simple eluded every engineering conference since 1939? 2 days later, on June 8th, the questions reached their destination. Becker, still salty, bruised, and sunburned from Omaha, was summoned to a commandeered farmhouse being used as a temporary headquarters. Inside, a long wooden table held Colonel Arthur Trudeau, the same senior engineer who had recently declared fast mine detection under combat conditions physically impossible, alongside British demolition expert Major Geoffrey Pike and 7 other ranking officers. Trudeau wasted no time. "Private Becker," he said, "explain your method." Becker laid it out plainly. Water moved differently over objects buried beneath sand. Flow patterns revealed density disruptions. Visual detection was faster than tactile probing. Simple physics, nothing more. Major Pike cut him off before he could finish. "This contradicts established mine detection theory," Pike said sharply. "Water pressure should trigger sensitive fuses. You're describing a technique that ought to detonate mines, not detect them." "I've used it on 43 so far," Becker replied. "No detonations." "That's anecdotal," Pike fired back. "Statistically meaningless." "More meaningful than the 60% casualty rate from approved procedures," another officer muttered. The room erupted overlapping voices. Accusations, warnings about discipline, talk of court-martialing a private who had stepped outside the chain of command. Then Colonel Trudeau raised a hand. Silence fell immediately. This was the man who had built defenses that held against Ludendorff's spring offensive. When he spoke, others listened. "Gentlemen," Trudeau said, "this private has solved a problem we could not. We can waste time debating manuals, or we can acknowledge what is happening outside on those beaches. His method works. I witnessed it myself." Pike tried to interject again, but Trudeau cut him off. "We don't have the luxury of running controlled tests. We have the largest amphibious operation in military history underway. We have time only for what saves lives. Effective immediately, all engineer units will be issued buckets and trained in water flow detection." He scanned the room. Questions? There were none. Becker was promoted to corporal on the spot and ordered to begin training other engineers. Within days, his method was being taught across the European theater, and the data began pouring in. Between June 6th and June 30th, units using traditional probing located an average of 4.2 mines per hour with a casualty rate of 12%. Teams using Becker's method averaged 11.7 mines per hour with casualties dropping to 1.3%. The numbers didn't just support the method. They vindicated it. And they proved that one private from Iowa had overturned a conclusion signed by 23 experts just 4 weeks earlier. The bucket method did not remain a curiosity for long. Once the first reports reached higher command, and Trudeau made his ruling, the technique spread through frontline engineering units with remarkable speed. In the hedgerows of Normandy, teams began adapting it immediately. Instead of seawater, they used canteens. Instead of beach sand, they studied how water behaved on packed soil, on rutted farm lanes, even on dirt mixed with shattered brick and debris. The principle held. Flow irregularities still revealed hidden mines just as reliably as they had on Omaha. In the forests of the Ardennes, where snow blanketed everything, engineers melted handfuls of ice and poured thin streams of water across frozen ground. Even under winter conditions, The behavior of the meltwater betrayed the outline of buried charges. Becker's improvised insight proved flexible enough to function far from the shoreline where it was born. By mid-July, the method was part of daily operations in France. Entire battalions were being trained in the technique, and field commanders began reporting staggering clearance numbers. In one operation near Saint-Lô on July 18th, Becker, now a sergeant, led a team through a ruined village. The main road, seeded with mines by retreating German forces, needed to be cleared in under 4 hours for the 2nd Armored Division to advance. Armed with 20 buckets and 12 men, Becker divided the team into pairs. They moved quickly, pouring water, marking suspicious areas, and confirming each detection with careful probes. The road stretched for half a kilometer. Under standard doctrine, the task should have taken a full day and cost several lives. Becker's team finished in 3 hours and 40 minutes. They detected 62 mines. Casualties, 0. Lieutenant Colonel James O'Neill, commanding the Engineer Battalion, watched the process unfold. When the last mine was lifted and the barricades cleared, he walked straight to Becker, extended his hand, and said words that Becker would remember for the rest of his life. "Because of you, my men are going home after this war." But the impact didn't stop at the Allied lines. Captured German engineering officer Hermann Klaus Richter was interrogated in August 1944. His testimony, later preserved in U.S. Army intelligence archives, included a striking admission. German observers had seen American engineers using water to detect mines, and the technique had shaken their confidence. "We believed the Americans had new electronic equipment," Richter said. "Only later did we learn they were using buckets. It damaged morale. If the enemy can defeat our best defenses with seawater and containers, what chance do we have?" Even the psychological advantage of Germany's minefields began to erode. The very idea that Allied forces had cracked the code of their most effective defensive weapon with an idea born in the surf spread uncertainty among German units tasked with laying more mines. Across Europe, the flow of water over sand, soil, and snow had begun rewriting the rules of mine warfare. The clearest proof of Becker's innovation came not from Normandy's beaches, but from the next major Allied push into occupied territory. In September 1944, during Operation Market Garden, British engineering units faced one of their most demanding assignments, clearing the road to Arnhem under relentless German fire. They had deadlines to meet, armor waiting behind them, and no margin for delays. Under traditional methods, commanders projected well over 30 casualties before the route could be opened. Instead, they used Becker's system. For 6 hours, British engineers worked in the dust and rubble, pouring water, mapping the ground, and exposing mine after mine at a pace that stunned their officers. When the final tally came in, the numbers spoke for themselves. Indecent, 27 mines cleared. 3 casualties. A casualty rate of only 2.4%, a tenth of what the old methods predicted. The results reached high command almost immediately. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, a man famously sparing with praise and rarely impressed by American improvisation, mentioned the bucket technique in a classified report to the War Office. His note was brief but telling. "The American water detection method has proven invaluable. Recommend immediate adoption across Commonwealth engineer units." By the end of the war, Becker's technique had become standard practice throughout the Allied armies in Europe and the Pacific. Combat reports credited the method with reducing engineer casualties by 67% in mine-clearing operations, a figure that translated, in human terms, to roughly 2,000 lives saved. But its influence did not stop with the war's end. Military historians later concluded that rapid mine clearance, made possible largely through Becker's innovation, accelerated the Normandy campaign by 4 to 6 days. In 1944, a delay that long meant thousands more dead, exhausted divisions, and the loss of critical momentum at a moment when every hour mattered. Becker didn't see himself as a hero. He didn't attend the medal ceremonies where he received the Bronze Star, the French Croix de Guerre, and commendations from British command. He was too busy clearing mines near Aachen to stand on a podium. Reporters tried to interview him after victory in Europe, but he declined. He simply went home to Iowa, took over the family dairy farm, repaired tractors, and lived quietly with his wife Margaret. She later admitted she didn't even know the full story until 1952, when a former engineer from the 146th showed up at their doorstep to thank Becker in person. "He never spoke about it," she said in 1984. "He thought he just did his job." Meanwhile, the military world never forgot. His water flow detection method, formerly named water flow mine detection, in a 1945 U.S. Army field manual, remained part of the engineering curriculum at Fort Leonard Wood for decades. Even as new technologies emerged, ground-penetrating radar, metal detectors, and remote-controlled robots, Becker's approach stayed in the syllabus as a fail-safe solution when equipment broke or batteries died. And it would prove its worth again. The war moved on. New fronts opened. New technologies appeared. But Becker's idea refused to fade. Long after the beaches of Normandy had been secured, his method continued to prove indispensable. In 2004, 6 decades after D-Day, a U.S. Army engineer unit deployed in Iraq found itself in a dire situation. Their metal detectors had been destroyed in an IED attack, leaving them nearly blind in terrain laced with improvised mines. With no equipment left and no time to wait for replacements, the team improvised the only way they could. They reached for water bottles. And they used Becker's technique. In just 3 hours, they cleared 17 mines. The after-action report filed that evening credited their success specifically to legacy water flow detection methods developed during World War II. The same principle born in the surf at Omaha Beach, water exposing density changes under sand, was still saving lives in a completely different war, on a different continent, under a different generation of soldiers. Engineers and educators took notice as well. Becker's method began appearing in military engineering textbooks as a case study in innovative thinking under extreme pressure. MIT included it in coursework on practical problem solving. The British Army's Royal School of Military Engineering placed a photograph of Becker beside an old galvanized bucket in their museum at Chatham, the caption reading, "Simple solutions to complex problems." Even as modern armies adopted radar, detectors, drones, and robots, instructors continued to teach the water flow method as a vital backup for moments when technology fails, as it often does in the field. The U.S. Army acknowledged the method formally in 1945, naming it water flow mine detection in a new field manual. And decades later, long after the world had moved on from the Second World War, the technique was still part of the curriculum at Fort Leonard Wood, where new generations of engineers learned that innovation sometimes comes from the unlikeliest places. From a farm boy, with a bucket, on a beach no one thought he would survive. By the autumn of 1944, the man who had revolutionized mine warfare was already fading into the background of the very army he had helped save. Thomas Becker received the Bronze Star for Valor that October. The commendation praised him for developing an innovative detection technique that had preserved countless Allied lives in France. Not long after, he also earned the French Croix de Guerre and a formal mention in British dispatches. He wasn't present for any of the ceremonies. While officers pinned medals to uniforms in rear headquarters, Becker was several miles away, working alongside his team near Aachen, clearing yet another field ceded by retreating German forces. Honors meant little compared to the men who depended on him. When the war ended, journalists searched for the young sergeant whose invention had become the backbone of Allied engineering. Papers wanted interviews, photographs, and quotes. Becker quietly declined all of it. He went home, back to Iowa, back to the farm, back to the life he'd expected before a clerical error sent him into the most dangerous job on Omaha Beach. In 1946, he married Margaret, who helped run the dairy with him. For years, she only knew that her husband had been an engineer in the war. The extraordinary details stayed buried, just like the mines he once uncovered. It wasn't until 1952, when a former engineer from the 146th Battalion arrived unannounced at their farm, that she began to understand the truth. The visitor had traveled hundreds of miles just to shake Becker's hand. "Your husband saved my life," he told her. It was the first time she heard that sentence. Even decades later, Margaret would recall how Becker never once bragged about what he'd done. "He said he just did his job," she told a local paper in 1984. He didn't think he was special, yet the military never forgot. His technique, once dismissed as reckless improvisation, remained in doctrine long after the war. It shaped engineering training, influenced decades of practical problem-solving instruction, and continued to save lives whenever modern equipment failed or the battlefield demanded simplicity over technology. For Becker, the war ended quietly. For the world, the effects of his insight never stopped. Thomas Becker died in 1984 at the age of 62, collapsing from a heart attack while repairing a tractor on the same Iowa farm he had returned to after the war. His obituary in the Des Moines Register mentioned his military service in a single, unembellished sentence. It didn't reference the Bronze Star. It didn't mention the French Croix de Guerre. It didn't acknowledge that his bucket method had been credited with saving thousands of Allied lives. The world moved on quietly, but the consequences of his idea never did. Today, water flow mine detection is still taught as an emergency technique when electronics fail. His story remains in engineering textbooks, presented as a reminder that innovation rarely respects rank, formal education, or expectation. At the Royal School of Military Engineering in Chatham, a photograph of Becker stands beside a dented metal bucket under a small plaque that reads, "Simple solutions to complex problems." It's a fitting tribute, because Becker's legacy isn't about equipment at all. It's about perspective. It's about a young man who, in the middle of the worst day of his life, looked at a battlefield everyone else saw as hopeless and imagined a different way through it. No research laboratory, no classified briefing, no general's command, just observation, instinct, and the courage to act when lives depended on it. Sometimes, the ideas that change history don't come from experts. They come from the people standing closest to the problem. And on June 6th, 1944, that person was a two-year-old private holding a bucket. If you learned something new from Becker's story, or if you want more forgotten moments of engineering, improvisation, and battlefield innovation, consider subscribing. Over 70% of viewers aren't subscribed yet. Your support helps us bring more of these hidden chapters of World War II back to life. And if you know someone who loves history, share this video with them. Stories like this survive because we remember them,